My stepfather didn't know I was standing in the hallway when he made the call. He thought I was still at the hospital finishing my overnight shift. He thought the house was empty. He thought he was safe. He was wrong on all three. I heard him before I saw him, pacing the kitchen in his socks, voice low, the kind of low that isn't quiet by nature but quiet by design. I set my bag down on the entry mat without a sound and pressed myself against the wall the way I used to when I was 12 and didn't want to be noticed. The policy's in her name, he said. 2.5. Accidental. She works nights at a hospital. Anything could happen. People get mugged in those parking garages all the time. A pause. Then, I know what I'm doing, Ray. Just make sure you're ready to move on the house the second it clears. He hung up. I heard the refrigerator open, the sound of a beer can cracking. I stood in that hallway for a long time. Before I tell you what I did with what I heard, and what I found 3 days later in the filing cabinet he thought was locked, drop a comment and tell me this. What is the one moment you realized someone you trusted had been lying to you the whole time? I want to read every single one. My mother married him when I was 9. His name was Stuart, and he came with a boat he couldn't afford and a smile that worked on everyone but me. My grandmother called him charming. My aunt said my mother had finally found a good one. I sat at the reception table eating dry wedding cake and thinking that something about the way he laughed was slightly off. Too fast, half a beat ahead of the joke, like he was performing rather than reacting. I was 9. I didn't have the vocabulary for what I was sensing, but the body keeps score even when the brain is still in elementary school. My mother's name is June. She is the kind of woman who apologizes for sneezing, who brings homemade banana bread to neighbors she's never met, who genuinely believes the best interpretation of every situation is probably the correct one. She is soft in the way that certain people are soft. Not weak, not foolish, but open. Porous. The kind of open that loving people take advantage of without meaning to, and that calculating people take advantage of very much on purpose. Stuart took advantage on purpose. It started small, the way these things always do. He handled the finances because he was better with numbers. He managed the investments because she found it stressful. He suggested she cut back her hours at the dental office because we don't need the money and you're burning yourself out. Every suggestion came wrapped in care. Every boundary he built around her looked, from the outside, like protection. I watched it happen across 10 years of holidays and Sunday dinners and casual comments. I watched my mother get smaller and smaller inside a life that looked perfectly comfortable from the street. By the time I graduated nursing school and moved 30 minutes away, she had no credit cards in her own name, no access to the brokerage account, and no real idea what their actual net worth was. She thought that was normal. She thought that was what marriage looked like when a man took care of you. I grew up. I learned a word for it. I tried, once, to say it to her directly. She cried and said I didn't understand him, that he'd been through a lot, that I had never given him a real chance. I let it go. I told myself she was an adult. I told myself it wasn't my place. I told myself I could stay in my lane and just be there for her, and that would be enough. Then I stood in my own hallway and heard him put a price on my life. I went back out the front door. I sat in my car in the driveway for 40 minutes. I did not cry. I have never been a crier under pressure. I think the nursing does that to you, trains you to compartmentalize fast, because somebody in the room always needs you to be the steady one. I sat there and I breathed, and I thought very carefully about what came next. The wrong move was confrontation. I knew that immediately. If I walked back in and said what I'd heard, he would deny it and I would have nothing, just my word against his, and he'd had 20 years more practice than me at making himself believable. He would get ahead of it. He would tell my mother I was unstable, jealous, that I'd always had a problem with him, that this was just me trying to blow up her marriage. And she might believe him. That was the part that made my chest go tight. So I didn't confront him. I went back inside an hour later and said I'd forgotten my phone charger. He was watching football in the den. He waved without looking up. I smiled and went upstairs and stood in the hallway outside their bedroom and thought about what I actually needed to do. The filing cabinet was in the spare room he used as an office. It had a combination lock, the kind you buy at a hardware store that feels serious but isn't. I knew the combination because I'd watched him open it twice without realizing I was paying attention. Stuart had the habit of people who think they're the smartest person in every room. He didn't bother hiding things carefully because he didn't fully believe anyone around him was watching. I took a photo of the document on my phone and left everything exactly as I found it. The policy was real. $2.5 million. Accidental death and dismemberment. Taken out 18 months ago, my signature on the application was close. Really close, but not quite right. The loop on the G sat too high. I'd been signing my name since I was 7 years old, and I knew every corner of it. I sat with that photo for 3 days. I showed it to no one. I went to work, I did my shifts, I drove home, I ate dinner, I stared at the ceiling. On the 4th day, I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia. Not a friend, not a referral, just a name I found through the state bar's directory specifically because I wanted someone with zero connection to my life. I sat across from her in a downtown office and laid out everything I knew. She listened without interrupting, which I appreciated. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. "Do you have the recording?" she asked. I pulled out my phone. She listened to it twice. Then she set the phone on the desk between us and looked at me steadily. "Okay," she said. "Here's what you need to do. I won't walk through every detail of the next 6 weeks because some of it is still part of an ongoing legal matter. And also because 6 weeks of gathering evidence against your own stepfather is not interesting in the minute-to-minute. What I will tell you is that I bought a second phone. I kept it in my bag, and I got into the habit of leaving it in the kitchen or the living room when I visited, tucked between couch cushions or slid behind a plant. Always somewhere with a clear audio line to wherever Stuart liked to pace and talk. I visited more often than usual. I brought food. I fixed the leaking faucet in the guest bathroom that he'd been meaning to get to for 7 months. I was the pleasant stepdaughter who had apparently had a change of heart about family togetherness. My mother was thrilled. Stuart was not suspicious, exactly, but there was something in his eyes when he looked at me during those weeks, a faint recalibration, like he was trying to solve a math problem he hadn't expected to encounter. I'd been cold to him for years in the way adult children of remarriage can be cold, technically present, technically polite, never quite warm. The sudden shift registered, but he was also arrogant in that particular way of men who have never had their plans actually fail, and arrogance makes you sloppy. He kept talking on the phone in the kitchen. He kept pacing. The second recording was the one that mattered. 3 weeks in, I was visiting for Sunday dinner. I'd left the second phone behind the fruit bowl on the kitchen counter before I went to help my mother set the table in the dining room. Stuart stayed in the kitchen to refill the bread basket. The recording caught 7 minutes of a conversation with whoever Ray was. I still don't know his full name. About timeline. About how long after a claim is filed before a payout typically processes. About whether it would look strange if he moved the funds offshore quickly. It also caught him saying very clearly that my mother couldn't know anything about it until it was done. That she would be taken care of. That she didn't need the details. I had that recording transcribed by a service and the transcript notarized the next morning. The other thing I found, during week 4, was the second policy. This one I found because I went looking. The lawyer had suggested I try to understand the full picture of the finances, and she connected me with a forensic accountant who spent 2 weeks quietly pulling threads. The second policy was older, taken out of my mother 6 years ago. Stuart was the sole beneficiary. The coverage was for $1.8 million. I sat in the forensic accountant's office and stared at that number. I thought about my mother apologizing for sneezing. I thought about her cutting her hours at the dental office. I thought about how much she loved him, how fully she had rearranged herself around a man who had been pricing her out for years. I didn't cry then either, but it was close. The dinner where everything came apart was not planned. I want to be clear about that. The lawyer and I had a strategy, a cleaner, slower process that involved the police, a formal report, documentation handed over in an organized package. That was the plan. What actually happened was messier. And it happened because my mother called me on a Thursday afternoon, crying so hard she could barely form sentences. "He says we have to sell the house," she said. "He says there's debt I didn't know about. He won't tell me how much. He keeps saying everything will be fine, but he won't tell me anything, and I don't know what's happening." I asked her if Stuart was home. "He's here. He's in the office. He won't talk to me." "I'm coming over," I said. I called the lawyer on the way. She told me to stay calm, to not confront him directly, to let her contact the detective she'd already been in touch with. I said I understood. I drove with both hands on the wheel and the recorder on the passenger seat. The house was tense in a way that houses get when two people have been fighting and stopped. My mother was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea she wasn't drinking. Her eyes were red. When she saw me, she made a small sound, and I hugged her for a long time. Stuart came downstairs 20 minutes later. He saw me, and his expression did something complicated. Settled, recalibrated, decided. "Didn't know you were coming," he said. "Mom called," I said simply. He sat down at the table across from her. He did not look at me after that. He talked to her like I wasn't in the room, explaining in careful, measured terms that there had been some investment losses, that the market had been unpredictable, that the house was going to have to go, but they would come out fine. She needed to trust him. He had a plan. I listened. My mother looked at him the way she always looked at him, uncertain, wanting to believe, trained by 20 years of conditioning to treat his confidence as a substitute for information. "What's the debt?" I asked. He looked at me then, a long, flat look. "It's complicated," he said. "Debt usually isn't," I said. "There's a number. What is it?" "This is between me and your mother." "She called me because she's scared and you won't tell her anything," I said. "So I'll ask again. What's the number?" The air in the room changed. I could feel my mother holding her breath. Stuart leaned back in his chair. He put on the smile, the one that worked on everyone but me, the one that was half a beat ahead. "I appreciate the concern," he said. "But you don't have the full picture. You never do." I put my phone on the table. I opened the audio app. I pressed play. His voice came out of the speaker very clearly. "The policy's in her name. 2.5. Accidental. She works nights at a hospital. Anything could happen." The kitchen went absolutely silent. My mother set down her mug, very slowly, the way you set something down when your hands aren't sure they're working correctly. Stuart did not move. His face did not change expression. Practiced. I had to give him that. He was practiced. "That's taken out of context," he said. I pressed play on the second recording. "She can't know anything about it until it's done. She'll be taken care of. She doesn't need the details." My mother made a sound I had never heard from her before. It wasn't a sob and it wasn't a scream. It was something quieter and more devastating than both. "June," Stuart said. He reached across the table toward her hand. She pulled her hand back. It was such a small movement. She just moved her hand about 4 inches to the left, off the table and into her lap. But I had watched 20 years of her leaning toward him, accommodating him, rearranging herself to stay within reach. 4 inches felt like a mile. "There's more," I said. I slid a folder across the table. Inside was the printout from the forensic accountant. The first policy in my name, the second policy in hers. Dates, amounts, beneficiary designations. Stuart looked at the folder. He did not open it. "I want a lawyer," he said. "That's a good idea," I said. "You can call one from the station." He looked at me. For the first time since I was 9 years old and eating dry wedding cake, I saw something real move across his face. Not the performed warmth, not the practiced calm. Something genuine and unguarded. Something that looked a lot like fear. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "I've been doing it for 6 weeks," I said. "I'm pretty clear on it." I'd texted the detective 20 minutes before I walked in. She was part 2 blocks away. When I sent the second text, she came to the door with 2 officers. I let them in. My mother sat at the kitchen table the entire time, both hands wrapped around the mug she still wasn't drinking from, watching her husband of 20 years explain to strangers that there had been a misunderstanding. There had not been a misunderstanding. He was charged with insurance fraud, forgery, and, because of the conversation about the parking garage, because of the specificity of it, criminal solicitation. Ray, it turned out, had a history. The detectives found him faster than I expected. He cooperated in exchange for a reduced charge. He had a lot to say about what Stuart had asked him to do and when. My mother didn't speak for most of that first night. I stayed with her. We sat on the couch until 2 in the morning, and she asked me, at some point, why I hadn't told her sooner. It was the hardest question she could have asked because there was no answer that didn't contain something painful. "I needed it to be undeniable," I said. "If I'd come to you with just the phone call, he would have explained it away. And I didn't know if you would believe me over him." She was quiet for a long time. "I might not have," she said, "before tonight." That honesty cost her something. I could see it. I held her hand and didn't say anything. The legal process is still moving. These things take time, longer than movies make them look, less dramatic, more paperwork. What I can tell you is that the forensic accountant found significant financial discrepancies going back 11 years, that the house is being held as an asset, and that my mother has her own lawyer now, a good one, and her own bank account for the first time in 2 decades. She went back to the dental office last month, part-time, just to start. She came home and called me and said she'd forgotten how much she liked the work. How much she liked talking to patients. How much she liked talking to patients. How much she liked having somewhere to be that was just hers. She cried a little on the phone, the good kind of crying, the kind that means something is starting rather than ending. I am not going to tell you I am at peace with all of it. I don't think peace is the right word for what I feel when I drive past that house, or when I hear a man laugh in that particular half a beat ahead way, or when I lie awake at 3 in the morning and think about how close the margins were. How easy it would have been to never overhear that phone call. How different the end of this story could have looked. What I will tell you is that I am here. I am fine. I showed up to my shifts the whole 6 weeks, held hands through difficult diagnoses, helped patients call their families, did all the things you do. I have a good apartment and a closet full of work scrubs and a mother who texts me every morning now, sometimes just an emoji, just to say she's there. She asked me recently what made me stay in the hallway and listen that first day instead of just walking past. I don't have a clean answer. Instinct, maybe? Or maybe just the memory of being 9 years old and knowing something was off and not having the words for it yet. Maybe I was always listening. Maybe I was always waiting to finally have enough to say. If you've ever had someone in your life who smiled at you while calculating the cost of your absence, you know the particular stillness that comes with finally understanding what you were dealing with. It doesn't feel like victory. It feels like setting something very heavy down on the ground after carrying it for so long you forgot what your arms felt like. Empty. I set it down. That's enough. If someone in your life has ever made you feel like a resource instead of a person, share this story. And tell me in the comments, how long did it take you to see it clearly? The thing about carrying a secret for 6 weeks is that it changes the way you move through a room. I was sitting across from Stuart at that kitchen table the night everything came apart, watching him perform calm the way he'd been performing it for 20 years. And I thought about all the Sunday dinners I had sat through as a child, sensing something was wrong and not knowing what to do with the feeling. The difference between that 9-year-old girl and the woman who put the phone on the table and pressed play was not luck. It was not circumstance. It was a choice I made, quietly, every single day in between. I think about what Stuart was counting on. He was counting on me being too emotional to be methodical. He was counting on my love for my mother making me reckless, running in, screaming accusations, giving him the chance to reframe the whole thing as a troubled stepdaughter stirring up conflict. People who exploit others for a long time develop a very specific blindness. They stop being able to imagine that the people they've underestimated might be capable of thinking clearly. He saw me as a variable he already understood. He was wrong, and that wrongness cost him everything. What I did in those 6 weeks wasn't clever in any flashy way. I talked to a lawyer before I talked to anyone else. I documented before I confronted. I stayed in rooms I wanted to leave, and I kept my face neutral, and I let him keep talking because every word he said in that kitchen was another brick in a wall he was building around himself. That kind of patience isn't natural to me. I am not a patient person by temperament, but I understood that what was at stake required me to be better than my instincts. It required me to think past the next 5 minutes and into the next 5 months. The moment I let anger drive the timeline, I would lose. So I didn't. There's something I want to say about my mother, June, because I think it is the part of this story people might misread. She was not foolish. She was not weak. She was a person who had been slowly, deliberately conditioned over 2 decades to distrust her own perceptions and outsource her judgment to someone who was carefully managing what she was allowed to know. That is not a character flaw. That is what sustained manipulation does to a person. The fact that she pulled her hand back across that table, that 4-inch movement, in the moment she finally had undeniable proof, told me everything I needed to know about who she actually was underneath all of it. That instinct toward her own dignity was still there. It had just been buried. She's the reason I didn't walk away after I heard that phone call. I could have filed a police report, moved, changed my number, protected myself and let the rest of it sort out on its own. But I knew that if I didn't build a case that was airtight, he would talk his way out of it, and she would still be in that house, and the next time I might not overhear anything until it was too late. Doing the right thing is rarely the quick thing or the comfortable thing. It took 6 weeks of showing up to family dinners and smiling and leaving recording devices behind furniture. It took sitting in a lawyer's office and a forensic accountant's office and saying hard things out loud to strangers. It took holding everything I knew very still inside me while the world continued as if nothing was happening. The outcome followed from the choices. That is not magic and it is not fate. Stuart made choices too. He chose deception, he chose greed, he chose to see the people around him as instruments rather than as human beings with their own capacities. Those choices built his outcome just as surely as mine built a different one. What you do with what you know, and how long you're willing to hold your nerve while you do it, that tends to determine what comes next. I'm still figuring out what comes next for me, but I know I'm standing on ground I built. That's not nothing.